Okay, welcome back. We're beginning Unit 3. This is um, our noontime lecture on Monday, Memorial Day. So it's totally okay if no one is attending this lecture. And first thing I want to do is just very quickly kind of give an overview of Unit 3, and then we'll start talking about the Greeks. And I'll pause this lecture at any point if anyone is able to enter, even if they enter late. So let's start with, if you remember the unit 2, unit 1, we start with Paleolithic art, the most ancient prehistoric art, and we go all the way up to the Neolithic. And in unit 2, we talk about the art of the ancient world. Unit 3, we start with talking about um, the classical art of Greece, and to a degree, also art of Rome. And so the first lecture is on that and leads all the way to just very briefly discussing the Roman Empire. We'll talk a little bit more about the Roman Empire when we get to the next unit. We're talking about the art of the early Christian period and then early medieval art. So because we're talking about Greece, one of the art medium that we're going to be discussing is sculpture. And yeah, sculpture. And so if you remember unit 1, the art medium we talked about was drawing. Art in unit 2, the art medium that we talked about was ceramics. So sculpture, there's a lot to say about sculpture. That will not be this lecture. And like I said, there's a lot to say about sculpture. And I like to spend a lot of the end of each lecture talking about contemporary artists. So in this case, contemporary sculptors. And then sculpture leads to us talking about form as the primary design topic for the unit, but it also leads to us talking about texture. There's really three. And then especially because of talking about the difference between Hellenic versus Hellenic versus yeah. Um, Hellenic versus Hellenistic sculpture, that leads to talking about dynamics and movement and energy in art. And then our last lecture is on the issue of representation, really. Um, what is representation? What does it mean for representation to be real? What is a real representation? What is what is realistic? What is realism? These seem like might be obvious things, but they're actually quite complex and they are not what you think generally. And so that is the structure of the whole lecture. Now, getting back to classical Greece, as you can see here on this page, there is one, and we're talking about the classical period. There's one piece of Greek ceramics here, but we've already seen some Greek art. So we're gonna just for a second switch PowerPoint lectures and just look at this one for a second here. Remember when we were talking about ceramics, we took kind of an aside to discuss in depth Greek classical period ceramics and specifically the transition from the geometric period, which is like going all the way back to late archaic, all the way to and then through the period of Persian influence, otherwise known as the Orientalizing period, and then into black figure, and then into red figure. There is actually in Greek sculpture, there's another period that's usually called white figure, which is a separate period that goes very late classical into the Hellenistic period. And then Hellenistic ceramics, just as an aside, gets very diverse. And it's not really until the Romans that we have much more of a kind of a consolidated set of like looks. But Greek ceramics were extremely popular, extremely admired, both during the period that the Greeks were making these, but also into the Hellenistic period. These classical period pots were extremely admired and were also admired by the Romans. And so it's important because when we're doing the lecture on Greek civilization, don't forget these images, these works, because this is as much a part of the picture. Ceramics and architecture and sculpture, and to a lesser degree, painting, although we don't really have many examples of Greek painting, but all of them were considered an important part of the Greek cultural product that they sent out to the world and why all the other cultures admired them as much as they did. Okay, getting back to, oh, Leanne is here. Right. Leanne, don't forget to sign into the chat. And before I get started, I just did a very brief overview of Unit 3, what is covered in Unit 3, and then a kind of quick going back to looking at Unit 2, looking at the ceramics of the Greek classical period, just so we can remember to fit that into this part of the lecture. Do you have any questions before I get started? Leanne, can you hear me?
Hey, yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
No questions.
No questions? You're certain. Okay. Um, all right, well then do you want so my plan was to just go ahead and do the art historical lecture for Unit 3 as a starting point here, but I don't have to do that. Is there anything from Unit 2 that you want me to go back over? Anything from Unit 1 that you want me to go back over? Leanne, you there?
Hey, sorry, I'm trying to set up the video on one screen and just use the voice from my phone.
Got it.
I'm listening.
Okay, all right. So my question was, is there anything you want me to go back to, like anything from Unit 1 or Unit 2 that you'd like me to cover in more depth before, or should I just go ahead and straight into talking about classical Greece?
Yeah, just go ahead and start in on classical Greece.
Okay, all right. So classical Greece, where were we? Well, if you remember in terms of kind of history and art history, the last things we were talking about was the expansion of the Persian Empire. And I had mentioned how the Persian Empire had expanded all the way towards Greece. And that one of the unusual things that happened that was kind of surprising historically was that Persia tried to expand into Greece and failed. And it was kind of a series of wars, a series of events, but um, the end result, when everything was done, was that um, many parts of Greece were actually, like many of the city-states, were significantly weaker, but Greece as a whole was stronger. But this time they were under the leadership of Macedon, which was a kind of a group of a kingdom to the north of them that was sort of Greek-like, right? The Macedonians. And ruled at this time by Alexander the Great, and he wound up not only completely defeating the Persians, but taking over their empire entirely. So it went from the Persians trying to take over the Greeks to the Greeks taking over the entire known world. And it took, like, that whole process was probably about 150 years from the first attempts that the Persian Empire had to expand into the Greek mainland. And so it's a bit of a surprise historically. Um, but because of that, we have this very kind of like specific, very positive picture of Greece and of this moment in Greece. The classical period, also sometimes I refer to even more specifically the Periclean age of this high point of Greek culture. Okay. But before we get too far in, we probably should talk about like why is Greek culture um, why is it considered special? Is it really special? And there are before we there's the explanations as to what happened in terms of like historically. But there's also probably a bigger issue, which is that how much is our bias? How much is just the way we read into things? How much do we see the Greeks as being special because they won eh, and because we have inherited so much from them. If history had turned out differently and we had been much more in debt to the Persian culture and the Persian cultural products as being part of Western culture, then we would probably have a very different view of the Greeks as just being minor and of the artworks of the Persians as being the epitome, perhaps. So, okay, so that one, I just want to say, like, we have to always take it with a grain of salt. Maybe they aren't as special as they seem to us. It's just our perception of them, our use of them that makes them special. Another thing to keep in mind is that, so in terms of historical things, what are the reasons why the Greeks became so important? One, because seafaring trading was becoming more and more important. This was starting at the kind of like the mid Iron Age, the rise of the Phoenician city-states, Carthage, even Rome to a degree, and the Greek city-states, and them all competing in terms of creating colonies all around the Mediterranean world, especially the western part of the Mediterranean world, like Spain, the western parts of Mediterranean Africa, the western parts, or from the point of view of the Greeks, like the southern parts of France, all of those, and having colonies in all of those places started to make um, started to make Mediterranean trade the most important economic kind of factor compared to in earlier periods where it was much more inland road trade that was the most important thing, like the trade from the Levant and from Mesopotamia towards places like Afghanistan or into the mainlands of Anatolia, where land-based trade, road-based trade was really important. What was happening at this period was that sea trade was becoming way more economically viable. It was just becoming way more easier for people to trade a lot more stuff. And so the Persians were on the outside of this since they were a land-based empire, right? So the rising importance of seafaring trade, the defeat of the Persian Empire and the eventual complete adoption, absorption of the Persian Empire. Um, and also another thing that I think is an explanation is kind of like the Greeks um, as these very competitive city-states that were constantly trying to outcompete each other, not just in small skirmish warfare and sometimes in big warfare, not just competing with each other in terms of who could get the most colonies in different parts of the world, not just competing with each other in terms of who could send the most mercenaries to support whichever king, but they were also competing with each other in artistic productions in terms of like who produced the most interesting plays, who produced the greatest philosophers, who produced the greatest artists. All of this was the Greek culture was very kind of like it loved athletics and it was very competition based. And that added to this kind of idea of the Greek culture being split up into these small city states led to a cultural system that allowed a lot of diversity, but also um, a lot of kind of unity and competition. And so, yeah. And I think all of those, as well as the ones that I've kind of like listed up here, are all good explanations as to why sort of that kind of golden age of Greek culture, why it happened. It's also important to remember that the Greeks were inheritors of a lot of culture. There's a lot that they took from the Egyptians, from the Levant, from the Anatolians, like including the Lydians and the Lycians um, and the Phrygians, a lot that they took from Mesopotamian culture and from the Persians. So they were quite willing to adopt and adapt. So, in terms of art history, we're not going to be talking about ceramics that much because we talked about that in the previous lecture. We're going to be talking primarily about architecture and about sculpture. And in architecture, some of the main things that you need to know is that there was this kind of like slow development going from the archaic period into the classical period, where in the oldest parts of the archaic period, almost all the architecture was made of wood in Greece. And then there was kind of a period where much of the architecture was made of stone, um, right? Like the columns, but a lot of the roof was generally made of wood and tile. And then into the classical period where we had some buildings like the Parthenon, which were made entirely of stone, including the roof and the roofing tiles and everything were all cut marble, which was pretty impressive, pretty amazing. And in the more archaic periods, the um, the architecture was way more kind of way more conservative, way more stout, like heavy, and less tall and rising and slender. And so, and then also out of this kind of time period and this transition into the classical period, we have the development of the three main Greek orders of architecture. The Greeks, you know, like architecture was developing and there were a lot of different things, but the Greeks liked to put things into systematic orders. And so they basically thought of Greek architecture as in two orders plus a third, right? Like there's the Doric and the Ionic, and I'll explain a little bit of the difference of what those terms mean. And then there was that third one, which was the Corinthian. So Doric and Ionic are both named after large kind of ethnic groups. It- Generally, many of the language, like the Greeks all spoke Greek, right? But they all spoke different dialects of Greek that were almost unintelligible to each other from place to place. And so one of the main categories of dialects were the Doric dialects. So, and this is like in the mainland of Greece, especially around Sparta, they all spoke Doric Greek. In Athens, they all spoke Attic Greek. Interestingly enough, there is no such thing as an Attic order of architecture. There were some other orders of architecture that were um, less well known, like there was an Aeolian order of architecture, but these three are the main ones, right? So there was Doric, and then there was Ionic, and the Ionic Greeks primarily were the Greeks who lived either on the far western islands and western coast of Greece, or actually were living on the eastern coast of Anatolia, of what is now today Greece. So they were the ones who kind of ventured away. They were the ones who were more island based. And the Ionic architecture was generally much thinner, much lighter, and was usually, and by the time we get to the classical period, the kind of the assumption was Doric was the serious order, and that was the one that was used for big, important, serious buildings. And the Ionic was the prettier, lighter, more uh, what's the word I'm looking for? More lyrical, and that was used sometimes for like could still be used for religious buildings, but might be used for like slightly subordinate or less important. So that like, if you had a complex and you had let's say a temple to Zeus, and then you wanted um a small little kind of like chapel sort of rotunda or something to either to honor Hera or to honor maybe Heracles, someone kind of associated with Zeus, um, a god or a demigod. You might use the Ionic for the smaller one and use the Doric for the larger and more substantial one, right? So Doric was generally considered more conservative. Doric was considered more stately, more serious, more stout. It was the heavier one. Ionic was lighter and thinner. Um, and then Corinthian was generally seen as kind of um, the compromise between the two systems, where it allowed. And interestingly enough, so Corinthian is named after one single city-state, Corinth, which, if you might remember, Corinth is the city that produced the most ceramics that we looked at. Like Corinth was kind of like the hotbed of Greek ceramics for a long period. And so one of the main things that you might notice about the differences between the systems is the capitals, right? The Doric capital is this just round thing that just kind of holds up. The Ionic has these volutes, which kind of look like ram's horns. And then the Corinthian has these leaf shapes that kind of then connect to also these volutes but they're instead of being sideways, they're more diagonally oriented. So there's an element of the Corinthian being kind of like the best of all worlds sort of aspect. But there are some other things, such as in the Doric, the columns are always they always have um, well, one in Doric they don't have a base, whereas in the Ionic and the Corinthian they do. Um, in the columns they have um, shoot, what's the term I'm looking for? It'll fluting. They have the fluting, right? Where like those lines that go up and down along the side. But notice that the fluting system is actually quite different between the Corinthian and the Doric. Or if you got up close, you could see like in the Corinthian, it kind of like is a scooped out, sort of like curved, whereas in the Doric, it's also kind of scooped out, but it comes to a point, right? Like so. It's a slight difference. And then there are some other more subtle differences as to like a good example is in Doric, the outside frieze always is done with a what's called a triglyph, these three bars right there, and then a square section called a metope. And that's for the outside frieze. For interior friezes in various parts of the building, you could have continuous friezes, whereas in Ionic and Corinthian, it was much more acceptable to have a continuous frieze. A frieze, by the way, is a continuous space of flat relief sculpture, like going in a row in a line. Okay. Is there anything else I want to explain about the Greek orders? So, um, I think that's about it. And it'll be a test question and for you to be able to identify the Greek orders and usually kind of like an extra credit question for you to be able to come up with differences between the Greek orders that are not the capitals themselves, but other things that are different about the Greek orders of architecture. Okay, and then let's look at Greek sculpture. So in Greek sculpture, we similarly have a transition from the archaic period into the classical period. And here we're looking at some very more archaic looking ones. And you can really get a sense looking at this particular Koros figure that there was a strong influence from Egypt, like with the 1 foot forward stance and both shoulders being completely square, just that kind of stance and the staticness of it. And so there is a very, yeah, kind of, there's also a certain kind of Mesopotamian quality to like the way the knees are carved. By the time we get to this Koros figure, which would be about 60 years later, it's much more rounded and more fluid, but it's still got that Greek 1 step forward step and that, shoulders square and hips square kind of quality and an absolute kind of like blank sort of look on the face. One thing to know is the word Koros in this period of Greek sculpture, a lot of the figures were Koros and Kore figures, and Kore is like means maiden, and Koros means young man. And um, oftentimes, a lot of the Koros figures would have been uh, made in honor of a particular athlete, like and sometimes they were made in the honor of like a young athlete who had died young. And so we go from there to here. And if we'd had a lot of time, I could show you a little bit more of the transition, but we don't have a lot of time. So how do we get from there to here, right? How do we get from this where it feels still very much heavily indebted to other cultures? It feels like I mean, we can see the beginnings of it with this figure, the roundedness, but we have some new factors here. Number one, we no longer have that kind of classical Egyptian 1 foot forward, 1 foot back, but square kind of stance. Instead, we have a new kind of stance. Notice the hips are on an angle and then the shoulders are on the opposite angle, and all the weight is described as coming down on one leg, whereas the other leg is kind of bent a little bit and it's just there to support. And that stance is called contrapposto. That's an Italian word, but we use it to describe Greek sculpture as well as Roman and Italian sculpture. But um, anyway, and it means counterpoised or counterpose. And the idea is that the weight is balanced against each other, right? And the Greeks loved, by the classical period, they really loved this pose because what they were aiming for was something that felt both a little bit timeless, but also very natural and relaxed and informal. And so this for them really kind of captured that idea of both feeling like the sculpture, because like true action poses look to them very unnatural in sculpture because they're frozen, right? Like if someone was in the act of, like if they did a sculpture of someone in the act of swinging a sword, they would have felt like it looked weird and unnatural. Like it needs to be something still that the person is doing. But at the same time, this particular pose, it feels still, but also feels like has the potential of motion, right? If we look at like this kind of pose, it feels still in the sense of like timeless, in the sense of eternal still, right? Like they're never going to move. Whereas this here with Doryphoros, where's my cursor? It's in here somewhere. There it is. Feels still in the sense of like the moment before action. And that was kind of a thing that the Greeks were aiming for. But one of the things I have to also be clear about is that these may seem very realistic to us, right? Very naturalistic. And definitely naturalism was a strong part of what the Greeks were interested in. But for them, foremost, more than anything, they still wanted these to be idealistic, right? They wanted them to be idealized images. So, in a way, abstract images of the perfect world rather than images of like the real world. They didn't want to make a sculpture. They didn't To them, the idea of making a sculpture, whether it was just a like this one, the spear bearer was just a kind of a classical ideal of someone wielding a spear, or a sculpture of a god. They didn't want to make a sculpture like this one of Hermes that read like an actual portrait of a person. Yeah, they might have used models, they would have studied anatomy, but they didn't want the sculptures to look like the model exactly, right? Because if they looked exactly like the model, then they would have looked exactly real world, right? Exactly too tied to the physical world. And they wanted these to look more like the ideal world. And we kind of have to pause just for a second here. And in class in person, what I would do here is I would actually take a good long, like 10-minute break for us to talk about Plato and the allegory of the cave and the Platonic idea of the ideal, of ideal forms. I'm going to do it. And what I would do is I'd actually like, I'd bring out objects and I'd pull a chair out and would have us examine the chair and think about the chair and think about the perfect idea of a chair. The way it would work is like think about chairs in the ancient world, right? Like think about if you were living back then, right? And you were living in a house and you had many nice chairs, but every chair you owned probably was, 50 to 100 years old, and they all had flaws. They were, breaking apart here or there. And every house that you went at, except for maybe your richest friends, you would rarely see a chair and go, "Oh, that's practically a perfect chair," right? So like chairs, because they were real world things, were much more flawed and irregular, right? Like every chair would have been made slightly differently. There would have been a lot less. It's not like there were factories that made a whole bunch of chairs exactly the same. And so the Greeks had this idea, or the Greek philosophers did, that then led to other Greek thinkers to have this idea that like every every chair, every real world chair is kind of a real world imperfect attempt or reflection on the perfect idea of a chair that like in our heads we can think of chair like the abstract concept of chair, and we can come up with the perfect chair in our mind that is like perfect in every way, right? But that can never exist in the real world because the real world is the real world. And that perfect chair can only exist in the realm of our mind and the realm of the gods, right? So um so therefore, like for the Platonic ideal, the idea is that you don't want, like if you're making sculpture, you don't want it to feel too real world, too realistic, right? You study the real world, and that's called naturalism, but you don't reproduce the real world. You aim for something higher than that, right? You aim for it to look like the ideal. Okay. So moving on to Hellenistic sculpture. So there is also a strong transition from Hellenic to Hellenistic architecture as well, but we're primarily going to be talking about the Hellenic to Hellenistic transition in terms of sculpture. So first we have to define our terms. What is the difference between Hellenic and Hellenistic? Okay, so Hellenic describes this whole period of Greeks living in Greece, as well as living in parts of Anatolia, which is now Turkey, and also having some colonies otherwise, but they're all generally Greek-speaking people participating in Greek culture, although Greek culture was quite varied. The difference between Attic Athenian culture versus Doric Spartan culture or Corinthian culture, right, or other Ionian cultures could be quite different. But they all shared kind of Greek culture, roughly a belief in the same Greek gods, roughly a belief in the same kind of Greek ideals. They all read Homer mostly, although they might have read different versions. And so they were all Greek. And that went from going to the Archaic period all the way up to the end of the Classical period. That was all Hellenic. But after Alexander, who was not actually Greek himself, but was Macedonian, an ethnic group that was similar to the Greeks and inherited a lot from the Greeks. They borrowed a lot from the Greeks, but he was not Greek himself. He was Greek educated. He studied under Aristotle. Um, but he was not Greek himself, but he conquered pretty much all of mainland Greece and then immediately then organized this Greek and Macedonian army to go fight the Persians. And instead of just defeating the Persians, they then wound up conquering the entire Persian Empire and even expanding it further, going all the way to India. It's pretty impressive. And then he very shortly after that died and then left this world completely transformed. And now, in the aftermath of what Alexander had done, making this big world where Greek culture had spread all over, right? And there were now Greek kingdoms all over what used to be Mesopotamia and Egypt and all the lands in between, what used to be Elam, what used to be all of these different places in the Middle East, what used to be Phrygia. It was now all kind of like ruled by Greek/Macedonian type culture. Mostly these were ex-generals of Alexander who were Macedonian, but were also like Alexander, well trained in Greek culture, well trained in Greek language, and were admirers of Greek and brought along a lot of Greek people with them. And so we now have this much more expanded world where Greek culture is no longer just in Greece and just for ethnically Greek people, or even just for people who speak Greek. Because, like in any parts of this world, let's take the Levant at this time, like the parts that would today be called Syria, like let's say Damascus and Antioch. In those cities, still a lot of the people didn't speak Greek, but the elites spoke Greek, right? And but everyone in a way was part of this Greek kind of thinking, Greek speaking world. And everyone was part of this Greek cultural world, including the artwork. And so we see this strong division between Hellenic, which means Greek, versus Hellenistic, which means Greek-like, right? And in the Hellenistic world, we have a lot of artwork as well, and a lot of beautiful artwork, but it's quite different from. And the classical Greeks, the Greeks of the previous period, would have, to a degree, been somewhat appalled by some of the things that these Hellenistic artists were doing. But it's still quite impressive. So, what are some of the main differences between Hellenic art? Hellenic art tended to be more conservative, tended to be more restrained, was not interested and more idealized, and was not interested in as much kind of like expressiveness, and definitely not interested in as much kind of like dynamic action and struggle and pose. Um, I mean, especially in freestanding, they would put stuff like that a little bit more in kind of low relief and shallow relief. But even then, they tended to do it in a much more kind of like static and idealized way. The Hellenistic artists, artists of Hellenistic Greek culture, were much more interested in like real drama. And oftentimes people might make the comparison of how like Hellenistic sculpture and art was in a way similar to like Renaissance was to Baroque, right? That like the Hellenistic feels like the Baroque version of the Hellenic art. So another thing that was different about Hellenistic art was an interest in looking at a lot more of the world, right? That because because there was no longer this strong tie to the idea that art was only about idealization, only about like the Platonic ideal kind of the Platonic ideal forms kind of idea, then it opened up artists to make sculptures where they're like, like in the culture of Alexandria, they made sculptures that were like it was a common motif to make sculptures of beggar women. We don't really know exactly why they were interested in this, but this was something that they would do. And it seems like it's a very unclassical, unHellenic decision, right? Because the Hellenic classical Greeks would have wanted something that was much more idealized. But this is something much more real world based, almost realistic. And similarly, the bronze statue, the dancer, is also kind of like uh, this interest in more more real world, more even to a degree almost like socially realistic. So the last piece we're going to talk about to represent um, the Hellenistic world is the altar of Zeus at Pergamon. And we've already, to a degree, seen a little bit of this in that the Dying Gaul here was also a work of sculpture that was made in Pergamon, and it was part of the uh, same kind of whole construction process. And what I mean by that is that like after Pergamon was attacked by the Gauls, and Pergamon, which was a small kind of kingdom by Hellenistic standards, but they were quite successful in having beaten off the invading Gauls, right? And by doing this, they decided to make a whole bunch of uh, architecture and artworks and sculpture to honor the gods, to thank the gods for their success. So the main building that they made was this altar of Zeus, but they also created this series of sculptures that we now call the Dying Gauls. And and it's an interesting, we'll talk about the Dying Gauls a little bit more in another lecture because it's an interesting thing to think about as to why, for the Pergamons, to celebrate their victory, the thing they wound up doing was kind of the honoring the peoples that they defeated. And and here we are at the altar of Zeus, and it's a pretty good example. And you can see that it's using ionic columns, but it's taking some liberties with the ionic system. Like the spacing here is not how in classical Greece they would have done the spacing. It was a little bit more open, especially on the front. The frieze is way more dramatic. I mean, it's definitely building off of uh, some of the things that like on the Parthenon. And there is a strong sense that this was kind of like Pergamon was trying to make the second Parthenon. They were trying to make a temple that would surpass the Parthenon, but would definitely feel like it was in the same trajectory. And so, yeah, this frieze is full of action and dynamics, and it's very exciting. Okay. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about today, and I think it's just this one more page, yeah, is about Roman art. I'm not going to show you a lot of images of Roman art today, although when we get to the next unit, in Unit 4, and I'm introducing early Christian art into medieval art, we will kind of do a little bit more of a recap and review of Roman art. But for right now, the main thing I want you to think about with Roman art is that the Romans, and first of all, I want to say that the Romans were not just copiers of Greek art and Greek culture. And they had a lot that was very particular to their own. And I will cover that a little bit more in the next lecture. But for right now, one of the main points I want to make is that the Roman Empire also did this fantastic job of kind of like spreading Greek culture, spreading specifically the Hellenistic, but also to a degree the Hellenic. They were like by the time we get to 150 BCE, the um, the classical ideals, like the a sculpture like this one, like Doryphoros, was completely out of fashion, and people, but the Romans really admired. They admired that one especially. They admired a lot of this stuff, including like Praxiteles sculptures, a lot of the sculptures for the classical period, and they admired them to a degree more than they admired a lot of the Hellenistic sculptures. And so they spread both. And so it's because of the Romans that we have such a clear picture, so much of. In fact, just to show you, once again, let's go back. This right here is a copy. It's not the original of Doryphoros. And in fact, it's a Roman copy, right? So the Romans did a lot of that where I think the original was actually in bronze, which is but the Romans did a lot of copies, especially did a lot of marble copies of Roman original bronzes. And unfortunately, bronzes don't um, don't last as long, and may wonder why. And the reason being because bronze can always be melted down to make useful things in times of war. And so, yes, so that's probably why we no longer have Doryphoros. And that's the end of the lecture. All right. That didn't take, that took about 45 minutes. Uh, Leanne, do you have any questions about the lecture on classical Greece, on anything else related to Unit 3? Leanne, can you hear me?
Sorry, I'm typing in that chat box.
Oh,
Uh,
okay. Oh, I
So
can
no,
I can
no,
pull that up.
this unit was easier to grasp. I think I was behind. I just felt overwhelmed and behind on the first two, but this one was easier to grasp.
Right. Yeah, I think part of it is that, at first, this idea of like every unit having four parts, I mean, it just seems a little, like a little bit much, and it's novel, new, and but once you get kind of used to the idea of like, okay, every unit we're going to cover an art history period, every unit we're then going to cover an art medium, and then because of those, that's going to lead us also to talk about some design concepts and to talk about some theme concepts based off of those things, and that's how each unit is kind of organized. It starts to have kind of a structure.
That's
But
love,
one of the
yeah.
things I will also say is that, just remember that the art historical parts, the art historical lectures, and the art medium lectures are going to be the ones that have, like 80% of the testable material on them. Like on this last lecture, let's go back for a second. Um, like things like the definition of contrapposto, things like knowing the differences between the Greek orders. Let's see what else. Knowing the difference between Hellenic versus Hellenistic. And um, those are probably going to be the main sort of like test questions that would come out of this lecture. Where, whereas oftentimes, like in the thematic ones, they might help you with writing some of your essays, but they're less, going to be less useful for just being able to pass the test kind of thing.
Right.
Um, and keep in mind that the design lectures sometimes can be very useful in terms of helping you be prepared for doing the design sketch assignment because you're usually very closely tied. Okay. Do you have any other thoughts or questions?
No, no.
All right. Well, if you're okay with it, then we'll end it there.
Yes.
And are you okay with me posting this? I should probably send an email to everyone. I mean, you're not visible and you haven't, not like you've said a lot that could possibly be, but I should check with everyone to make sure are you okay with me posting this so that
That'll be fine.
yeah.
That's fine.
Okay. All right. Well, you have a great rest of your afternoon. I hope you get some time on Memorial Day to just relax.
Thank you.
All right. See you later. Okay. Bye.